"You're not welcome here," my daughter-in-law said, right in the middle of Mother's Day brunch, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of erasing me from my own family. I remember the way the words landed, not loud, not dramatic, just calm enough to make it worse, like she had rehearsed them, like she had been waiting for the right moment to finally say it out loud. The dining room was filled with soft sunlight filtering through the tall windows, catching on the polished silverware I had once picked out myself, back when this house still felt like mine. There were fresh flowers on the table, white lilies and pale pink roses, arranged in the same crystal vase I had used for every holiday for over 30 years. I noticed something small before I even looked at her again. There was no place setting for me. 8 chairs, 8 plates, 8 folded napkins, and not one of them had my name. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. At 72, you learn to question yourself before you question others. Maybe I had miscounted. Maybe there was another table. But then I saw Daniel standing near the window, his back half-turned, pretending to check something on his phone. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look confused. He didn't look at me at all. That was when I understood. Vanessa didn't come up with this alone. I felt something shift inside me. Not a break, not yet, but a quiet rearranging, like furniture being moved in a dark room. I set the gift I had brought down on the edge of the table, a neatly wrapped box with a card that simply read, "For my family." I had spent 2 days choosing it, wanting it to be perfect, wanting to remind them that no matter how much time passed, I was still here, still part of this. Vanessa crossed her arms, her red dress catching the light in a way that felt almost deliberate, like she wanted to be seen, to dominate the room. Her gold bracelet clinked softly as she shifted her weight, her eyes scanning me with that familiar expression, the one that always made me feel like I was being evaluated and found lacking. "I think it's best if you head home," she added, her voice smooth, almost polite. "We're keeping things immediate family only." Immediate family. I repeated the phrase in my mind, turning it over carefully, examining it the way I used to examine antiques at estate sales, looking for cracks, for truth hidden beneath the surface. Immediate family. I had given birth to Daniel. I had raised him in this very house, walked these floors at midnight when he had fevers, sat at this same table helping him with his homework, teaching him how to hold a fork, how to say please and thank you. And now I was no longer immediate. I waited, just for a moment, giving him time to say something, anything. A correction, a laugh, a simple, "Mom, that's not what she means." But the room stayed still. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the one his father had insisted on buying during a trip to Boston, saying every proper home needed a clock that could be heard. I smiled then, not because anything was funny, and not because I wasn't hurt, but because in that exact moment, everything became clear in a way it never had before. The confusion was gone. The doubt was gone. All the small moments I had brushed aside over the past few years suddenly lined up in perfect order, like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. I picked up my purse, smoothing my hand over the leather as if it were any other ordinary afternoon. "Of course," I said softly, my voice steady, almost gentle. "I wouldn't want to intrude." Vanessa gave a small nod, satisfied, as if she had just handled something efficiently. Daniel still didn't move. I turned toward the door, my heels making quiet, measured sounds against the hardwood floor, each step deliberate, each step controlled. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. Because the truth was, I didn't need to. I had seen enough. And as I stepped outside into the warm May air, I realized something else, something that settled over me with a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. They thought they had just pushed me out. What they didn't realize was that they had just shown me exactly where I stood. And once you see that clearly, you don't argue. You don't beg. You don't even get angry. You simply remember. I did not drive home right away. I sat in my car for a long moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the warmth of the leather against my palms as if it could anchor me to something steady. The street was quiet, lined with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, the kind of neighborhood where everything looked perfect from the outside. I had helped Daniel buy this house 5 years ago, back when he still called me for advice, back when he still said things like, "What do you think, Mom?" I remember walking through these same doors when it was empty, sunlight spilling across bare floors, imagining where his furniture would go, where his future would begin. I had stood in the kitchen that day and told him it was a good house, a strong house, the kind that would hold a family together. I turned the key in the ignition but did not move. Instead, I let the silence settle around me, thick and unfamiliar. No one came after me. No one opened the door. No one said my name. That, more than anything, stayed with me. I drove slowly, keeping both hands on the wheel, passing familiar streets that no longer felt quite the same. The grocery store on the corner where I used to pick up Daniel's favorite cereal when he was a boy. The park where he learned to ride his bike, wobbling at first, then laughing when he realized he did not need me to hold on anymore. I had let go then because that was what mothers were supposed to do. I did not realize there would come a day when he would let go too, and not look back. When I reached my house, I paused before getting out of the car, looking at the front porch where a small potted plant sat beside the door, slightly wilted because I had forgotten to water it that morning. I had been in a hurry, wanting to arrive early, wanting to make a good impression, as if that still mattered. Inside, the house felt exactly as I had left it. Quiet, orderly, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and noticed the table. It was already set. A simple arrangement, nothing elaborate, just 2 plates, 2 glasses, and a small vase with fresh tulips I had picked up the day before. I had planned to bring some of the dishes with me, thinking it might be appreciated, thinking it might make the day feel more complete. Instead, everything sat untouched, exactly where I had placed it. I moved slowly, taking off my coat and hanging it on the back of the chair, smoothing it out as if I were preparing for guests who would never arrive. I walked over to the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the water run for a moment longer than necessary. It filled the silence, gave me something to focus on, something predictable. I looked out the window at the backyard, where the grass had grown just a little too long and the fence needed repainting. Robert used to take care of those things. He used to say that a home was not just walls and a roof. It was attention, small acts done consistently over time. I wondered what he would say now if he could see how things had changed. I turned off the water and dried my hands carefully, folding the towel the way I always did. There was no urgency in anything I did. No rush. No panic. Just a quiet awareness settling in, piece by piece. I walked to the dining table and pulled out a chair, sitting down slowly. The tulips were beginning to open, their petals soft and pale under the afternoon light. I reached out and adjusted the vase slightly, aligning it with the center of the table. Then I folded my hands in my lap and sat there, not waiting anymore, not expecting anything to change. Because something already had. And once you see it clearly, once the illusion falls away, there is no going back to the way things were before. It was not the first time I had been left out, and once I allowed myself to look back without making excuses for anyone, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my eyes resting on the small vase in front of me, but my mind moving somewhere else entirely, retracing moments I had once dismissed as misunderstandings. There was Christmas 2 years ago, when Vanessa had called me just 2 days before and said they wanted to keep things small, just the two of them, something quiet and intimate. I had nodded on the phone, telling her I understood, even thanking her for letting me know in advance, because that was the kind of woman I had always been, accommodating, reasonable, careful not to cause discomfort. Later that evening, Daniel had sent me a photo by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all, of a long dining table filled with people, laughter caught midair, glasses raised, and Vanessa standing at the center of it all, smiling as if she had orchestrated something perfect. I had stared at that image longer than I should have, trying to find a version of the story that did not hurt. Then there was my birthday last year, when Daniel had promised to stop by, said he would bring dessert, said we would celebrate properly. I had spent the afternoon baking anyway, just in case, because habits like that do not disappear overnight. 7 o'clock passed, then 8, then 9. My phone stayed silent. The cake sat untouched on the counter, the frosting smooth and undisturbed, as if it too were waiting for something that would not come. The next morning, there was a brief message. Something about work, about being busy, about making it up to me soon. I had replied with a simple, of course, because it felt easier than asking questions I was not ready to hear answered. Even smaller things began to take on new meaning. The way Vanessa would pause before answering me, as if deciding how much politeness was necessary. The way Daniel's voice had changed over time, less certain, more careful, as though every word passed through someone else before reaching me. The invitations that arrived later and later, until eventually they stopped arriving at all. I had told myself that families evolve, that people grow, that space is natural. I had told myself many things. Sitting there now, in the quiet of my own dining room, I realized that what I had called change was something else entirely. It was removal, slow and deliberate, carried out in ways that could always be explained, always be softened, always be denied if confronted. I reached for the edge of the table, running my fingers lightly along the wood, feeling the faint grooves that had formed over years of use. This table had seen everything: birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday dinners where nothing remarkable happened except that we were all there together. I used to believe that was enough, that being present, being consistent, being a steady part of someone's life would secure your place in it. But presence, I was beginning to understand, does not protect you from being replaced. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, my steps unhurried, my breathing even. There was no sudden rush of anger, no dramatic realization that demanded a reaction. Instead, there was something quieter, something far more stable. Clarity. I stopped in front of the small cabinet near the living room, the one where Robert used to keep important papers, documents he insisted should always be within reach, always organized, always ready if needed. I had not opened it in months, maybe longer. My hand hovered over the handle for just a moment before I pulled it open, not because I knew exactly what I was looking for, but because for the first time in a long while, I felt the need to understand everything that had been quietly unfolding around me. I opened the cabinet slowly, the hinges letting out a soft sound that echoed more than it should have in the quiet room, as if even that small movement carried weight now. Inside, everything was exactly as Robert had left it, neat folders stacked in careful order, each labeled in his precise handwriting. He had always believed that clarity was a form of protection, that if things were documented properly, no one could twist them later. I had smiled at that back then, teasing him for being overly cautious, telling him that family did not need paperwork to stay honest. My fingers brushed over the edges of the folders, pausing when I recognized one I had not opened in years. It was heavier than the others, thicker, the paper inside slightly worn from being handled more than once. I carried it to the dining table and sat down again, placing it in front of me with the same care I had used earlier when adjusting the vase of tulips. For a moment, I did not open it. I simply looked at it, letting the memory of Robert settle in around me, the way he used to sit across from me, reading glasses low on his nose, explaining things in that calm, steady voice that never rushed, never forced. He used to say that people reveal who they are not when everything is going well, but when they believe there will be no consequences. At the time, it sounded like something philosophical, something distant from our everyday life. Now, it felt like a warning I had not fully understood. I opened the folder and began to read, my eyes moving carefully over each line, not skimming, not assuming, but taking in every word exactly as it was written. The language was formal, structured, the kind that leaves little room for interpretation, and yet beneath it, there was something unmistakably personal. Robert had added notes in the margins, small clarifications in his own handwriting, as if he had anticipated questions I might have one day. I followed those notes, letting them guide me, piece by piece, until something made me stop. It was a clause, not large, not dramatic, but deliberate, a condition tied to behavior, to respect, to the way family members chose to treat one another. I read it again, slower this time, making sure I had not misunderstood. It did not speak in emotion. It did not accuse. It simply stated that certain actions, certain forms of conduct, would result in consequences that could not be undone. I leaned back slightly, the paper still in my hands, and let the meaning settle in fully. For the first time since that morning, I felt something shift again, but this time it was not quiet confusion or restrained hurt. It was recognition, not of betrayal, because that had already revealed itself, but of balance, of something that had been put in place long before I realized I might need it. I closed the folder gently, aligning its edges with the table as I had done with everything else, my movements steady, deliberate. Robert had not been paranoid. He had been prepared, and in doing so, he had given me something far more valuable than comfort. He had given me certainty. I rested my hand lightly on top of the folder, not gripping it, not claiming it in any dramatic way, just acknowledging its presence, its weight, its purpose. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, the afternoon stretching into early evening, shadows growing longer across the floor. I stood up slowly, carrying the folder with me as I moved toward the living room, my steps measured, my posture unchanged. There was no need to rush, no need to confront anyone immediately. Because what I now understood was simple, and once understood, it could not be undone. They believed they had removed me from their lives without consequence. They believed that silence meant acceptance. But silence, I was beginning to see clearly, could also mean something else entirely. It could mean that the moment had not yet arrived. And when it did, it would not require raised voices or explanations. It would only require truth, presented exactly as it was meant to be seen. I did not sleep much that night, not because my mind was racing, but because it had finally slowed down enough to see everything clearly, and clarity has a way of keeping you awake. The house remained quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer felt empty, but intentional, as if it were giving me space to think without interruption. I placed the folder neatly on the desk in the living room, aligning it with the edge the way Robert always did, and sat down beside it, not opening it again, not needing to. I already knew what it contained. Instead, I reached for the phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in over a year. Thomas Collins, Robert's attorney, the man who had handled every document, every detail, every careful decision that had shaped what we built together. My finger hovered for just a moment before I pressed call. It rang twice before he answered, his voice steady, familiar, carrying the same calm professionalism I remembered. "Margaret," he said, not surprised, not questioning why I had called after so long. "It has been a while." I allowed myself a small pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of control. "It has," I said. "I hope I am not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all," he replied. "What can I do for you?" I glanced at the folder without touching it. I was going through some of Robert's documents. I began, choosing my words carefully, and I came across a section I would like to confirm. There was no need to explain everything. He understood the nature of these calls. "Which section?" he asked. I opened the folder then, turning to the page I had read earlier, my eyes moving directly to the clause that had changed everything. "The behavioral clause," I said quietly. There was a brief silence on the line, not empty, but measured, as if he were considering how much to say. "Yes," he replied. "Your husband was very specific about that." I leaned back slightly, my posture relaxed, my voice steady. "Can you explain how it is applied?" I did not rush him. I did not fill the silence. I simply waited. "It applies in cases where a beneficiary demonstrates conduct that violates the conditions outlined," he said. "Disrespect, public humiliation, exclusion, or any action that intentionally diminishes your standing within the family structure." He spoke in clear, precise language, the kind that leaves no room for misinterpretation. "And the consequence?" I asked. "Immediate disqualification from inheritance rights tied to the estate," he said. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of emotion, but out of acknowledgement. "Without reversal?" "Without reversal," he confirmed. I let that settle, not reacting, not expressing anything beyond a quiet understanding. "Thank you," I said. "That is all I needed to know." "Margaret," he added, his tone softening slightly. "Robert put that clause in place for a reason." I allowed a faint smile to form, though he could not see it. "I believe I am starting to understand why," I replied. After I ended the call, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a moment, my hands resting calmly in my lap. There was no urgency in what came next. No need to confront, no need to explain. Everything that needed to be said had already been written, already been signed, already been prepared long before today. I stood up slowly and walked back to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same one I had driven down earlier, but now it felt different. Not because anything outside had changed, but because I had. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into spaces that were gradually closing around me, convincing myself that patience and understanding would be enough to hold everything together. But patience without boundaries is not strength. It is permission, and I had given far too much of that. I turned away from the window and looked back at the folder resting on the desk. It did not feel like a weapon. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like balance, something that had been waiting quietly, just as I had, for the right moment to be acknowledged. And now that moment had arrived, not with noise, not with conflict, but with certainty. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale light slipping through the curtains and settling quietly across the floor, as if nothing significant had happened the day before, as if the world had not shifted in ways no one else could yet see. I moved through the house the same way I always did, making coffee, setting a single cup on the counter, measuring each step with the same steady rhythm that had defined most of my life. There was comfort in that, in the repetition of small, ordinary actions that did not demand explanation. I sat at the kitchen table and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle, not rushing the moment, not trying to fill it with anything unnecessary. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to reach for my phone, to check for messages, to see if anyone had thought to follow up, to explain, to soften what had been said. I already knew there would be nothing. And more importantly, I no longer needed there to be. Around mid-morning, the phone rang, breaking the quiet with a sound that felt almost out of place. I looked at the screen before answering. Daniel. His name sat there, simple and familiar, yet it felt different now, as if it belonged to a version of him I had not seen in some time. I let it ring once more before I answered, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Good morning, I said, my voice even, unchanged. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone expects a different tone, a different reaction. Mom, he said, clearing his throat slightly. About yesterday, his voice trailed off, searching for something to attach to the sentence. An excuse, a justification, something that would make it easier to move forward without addressing what had actually happened. I did not interrupt him. I did not guide him. I simply waited. Vanessa might have been a little direct, he continued, choosing his words carefully, as if they needed to pass through an invisible filter before reaching me. But you know how she is. She just wants things to be organized. Organized. I repeated the word silently, letting it settle, the same way I had let everything else settle. I see. I replied, not adding anything more. Silence followed again, heavier this time, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much that neither of us was willing to speak aloud. We can have dinner later this week, he added quickly, filling the space. Just the three of us. We will make it up to you. Make it up. The phrase lingered in the air, vague and insufficient. I stood up slowly from the table and walked toward the window, looking out at the same street, the same quiet morning, everything unchanged and yet entirely different. That will not be necessary, I said gently. Another pause. Longer this time. What do you mean? He asked, a hint of confusion breaking through the careful tone he had been maintaining. I watched as a car passed by, its movement slow, unremarkable, a small detail in an otherwise still scene. I mean exactly what I said, I replied. There was no sharpness in my voice, no accusation, just clarity. You do not need to arrange anything for me. Mom, he began again, this time with a trace of something else beneath the surface, something uncertain, something he could not quite name. But I did not allow the conversation to shift into something else, something that would blur what had already been made clear. I hope you have a good week, Daniel, I said, my tone unchanged, consistent, final. I ended the call before he could respond, not abruptly, not dramatically, just at the point where everything that needed to be said had already been said. I placed the phone back on the table and stood there for a moment, my reflection faint in the glass of the window, my posture straight, my expression calm. There was no satisfaction in the silence that followed, no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had ended exactly as it was meant to. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the living room, where the folder still rested on the desk, unchanged, waiting. Not for action, but for timing. And timing, I had learned, was never about urgency. It was about precision. By the afternoon, everything in my house had returned to its usual order, but the meaning behind that order had changed in a way that could not be undone. I moved through each room with quiet precision, not because anything needed immediate attention, but because I understood now that small actions, done deliberately, could carry more weight than any confrontation ever could. I folded a blanket that did not need folding, adjusted a picture frame that was already straight, and watered the plant by the door, taking care to pour slowly, letting the soil absorb exactly what it needed and nothing more. Control, I realized, was not about force. It was about intention. Around 3 in the afternoon, I sat down at the desk again and opened the folder once more, not to search for something new, but to confirm what I already knew. The clause was still there, unchanged, clear, and precise, unaffected by emotion or circumstance. I read it again, letting each word settle into place with the same calm certainty as before. Then I reached for a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Not a letter filled with accusation, not a message meant to provoke, but something simple, direct, and unmistakably formal. A request for a meeting. I addressed it to Thomas Collins, even though we had spoken the day before, because some things deserve to exist in writing, not just in memory. I outlined exactly what needed to be reviewed, referencing the specific clause, the relevant documentation, and the timeline as it had unfolded. I did not embellish. I did not explain beyond what was necessary. Facts, I had learned, were far more effective when left unadorned. When I finished, I read it over once, ensuring that every word served a purpose, then placed it neatly into an envelope and set it beside the folder. I did not rush to send it. There was no urgency. Timing, as I had come to understand, was not about speed, but about choosing the exact moment when everything aligned. Later that evening, as the light outside softened and the house settled into its familiar quiet, my phone lit up again. A message this time. Vanessa. I looked at the screen for a moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. I think things got a little tense yesterday, she wrote. We should all move past it. Let us keep things positive. Positive. The words sat there, polished and hollow, as if it could erase what had already been said, what had already been done. I did not respond. There was nothing to clarify, nothing to negotiate. Some things, once revealed, do not require discussion. They require acknowledgement. I set the phone down without replying and leaned back in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the window where the last light of the day stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines. For years, I had believed that maintaining peace meant smoothing over discomfort, accepting small slights in the name of keeping the family intact. But peace, I now understood, is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of truth, even when that truth is inconvenient. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, picking up the envelope on my way. I slipped on my coat and stepped outside, the evening air cool and steady, grounding in a way that felt almost deliberate. The mailbox stood at the edge of the driveway, a simple metal box that had held years of ordinary correspondence, bills, invitations, holiday cards. Tonight, it would hold something different. I placed the envelope inside and closed the lid with a soft, final sound, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive. I did not linger. I did not look back, because what I had set in motion did not require my presence to continue. It would unfold exactly as it was meant to, guided not by emotion, but by something far more reliable. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to anticipate what would come next. I already knew. 3 days passed without interruption, each one unfolding with the same quiet consistency, as if the world itself had agreed to wait with me. I did not reach out, and no one came to my door. The house remained still, not empty, but settled, like it had finally exhaled after holding something in for far too long. On the 4th morning, the call came, not from Daniel, not from Vanessa, but from Thomas Collins. His voice was as steady as ever, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something more formal, more deliberate. Margaret, he said, I have reviewed your request. Everything is in order. We can proceed. I stood by the window as he spoke, looking out at the same street that had not changed, though everything else had. When? I asked, my voice calm, unhurried. Tomorrow afternoon. He replied, I have already notified all relevant parties. It would be best if everyone is present. Relevant parties. The phrase carried weight, though he delivered it without emphasis. That will be fine, I said. I did not ask who had been contacted. I did not need to. After the call ended, I remained where I was for a moment, my reflection faint in the glass, steady and composed. There was no anticipation, no nervousness, only a quiet readiness, the kind that comes when nothing is left uncertain. The next day arrived with the same measured calm. I chose my clothing with care, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the moment. A dark blue dress, simple, structured, the same one I had worn on occasions that required clarity rather than celebration. I fastened my pearl earrings, their weight familiar, grounding, a small reminder of who I had always been beneath everything else. When I arrived at the office, the building stood exactly as it always had, unremarkable from the outside, its presence defined more by what happened inside than by its appearance. I stepped through the doors and walked toward the conference room, my pace steady, my posture unchanged. They were already there. Daniel stood near the table, his hands resting against the back of a chair, his expression controlled but not entirely composed. Vanessa sat beside him, her posture upright, her expression carefully neutral, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed more than she intended. She glanced at me briefly, then away, as if eye contact itself required effort. I acknowledged neither of them with more than a slight nod as I took my seat. Thomas Collins sat at the head of the table, a folder open in front of him, documents arranged with precise order. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone professional, measured. "We are here to review a specific provision within Robert Whitmore's estate." His words were clear, each one placed with intention, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Daniel shifted slightly, his gaze moving between Thomas and me, searching for context that had not yet been offered. Vanessa remained still, her hands folded in front of her, her expression composed but watchful. Thomas turned a page and continued. "This provision outlines behavioral conditions tied to inheritance eligibility. It was included at the explicit request of Mr. Whitmore and is legally binding." The room remained quiet, but the air had changed, subtle but undeniable. "Recent events have brought this clause into relevance," he said, his voice steady, unaltered by the weight of what he was about to confirm. Daniel straightened slightly, his composure beginning to falter, confusion giving way to something else, something less certain. Vanessa's posture stiffened, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly. Thomas looked down at the document once more before continuing. "Based on documented conduct, the conditions for disqualification have been met." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with quiet finality, precise and irreversible. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete.